Sarah Mitchell never expected her life to take such a dramatic turn when she joined the military as a communications specialist. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she had always been fascinated by technology and wanted to serve her country. At 22, she was deployed to Afghanistan as part of a forward operating base team, responsible for maintaining communication links between different military units. The base where Sarah worked was located in a remote valley, surrounded by rocky mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Every morning, she would wake up to the sound of helicopters and the distant rumble of convoy vehicles. The landscape was both beautiful and dangerous, with hidden threats lurking behind every ridge and boulder. Sarah's daily routine involved checking radio equipment, updating communication protocols, and ensuring that all units could stay in contact with headquarters. She worked alongside soldiers from different branches of the military, but she had always admired the Navy SEALs who occasionally passed through their base. These elite warriors seemed to move with a confidence and skill that set them apart from everyone else. One particular SEAL caught her attention more than the others. His name was Marcus Thompson, a veteran with 10 years of experience in special operations. Marcus was tall and lean, with weathered hands that spoke of countless missions in hostile territory. What struck Sarah most about him was not his physical presence, but the way he treated everyone with respect, regardless of their rank or position. Marcus had a habit of stopping by the communications center whenever his team was at the base. He would ask Sarah about the equipment, showing genuine interest in how the technology worked. Unlike some soldiers who saw communications personnel as support staff, Marcus understood that people like Sarah were the lifeline that kept missions running smoothly. During one of these visits, Sarah noticed that Marcus seemed more serious than usual. His team had just returned from a particularly difficult mission, and there was tension in the air. She had overheard fragments of conversations about increased enemy activity in the region and new intelligence about planned attacks on American forces. As Sarah worked on updating the radio frequencies, Marcus approached her workstation. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. Without saying much, he sat down in the chair next to her and watched as she made adjustments to the communication array. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only by the steady hum of electronic equipment and the distant sounds of base activity. Sarah had learned that Marcus wasn't much of a talker, but his presence was reassuring. In a place where danger was always present, having someone like him nearby made her feel safer. That evening, as Sarah finished her shift and prepared to head to the mess hall for dinner, Marcus stopped her. He had something in his hands that he seemed reluctant to show her. After a moment of hesitation, he pulled out a small, worn photograph of a young girl with pigtails and a bright smile. The girl in the photo was his daughter, Emma, who was 7 years old and living with her mother back in California. Marcus explained that he hadn't seen Emma in 8 months, and that this deployment was supposed to be his last before retiring from active duty. He wanted to go home and be a full-time father, to make up for all the birthdays and school plays he had missed. Sarah was touched that Marcus had chosen to share something so personal with her. She could see the love and longing in his eyes as he talked about his daughter. It reminded her of her own father, who had served in the army when she was young, and how she had counted the days until his return from each deployment. As they walked to the mess hall together, Marcus told Sarah about his concerns regarding the current mission. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were planning a major offensive against several American positions in the region. The SEALs had been tasked with conducting reconnaissance missions to gather more information about these plans. What worried Marcus most was not the danger to himself and his team, but the potential threat to personnel like Sarah who were stationed at forward bases. These facilities were heavily defended, but they were also stationary targets that could be overwhelmed if the enemy managed to coordinate a large-scale attack. She had always known that serving in a combat zone involved risks, but hearing about specific threats from someone with Marcus's experience made those dangers feel more real and immediate. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at the base became increasingly tense. More reconnaissance missions were launched, and additional security measures were put in place. Sarah noticed that the SEALs were spending more time studying maps and satellite imagery, their discussions becoming more urgent and focused. During this period, Sarah and Marcus continued to talk whenever their schedules allowed. She learned more about his background, including his childhood in Texas and his decision to join the Navy after high school. Marcus, in turn, was interested in Sarah's technical expertise and her plans for after her military service. These conversations helped both of them cope with the stress of their situation. In the middle of a war zone, thousands of miles from home, they had found an unexpected friendship that provided comfort and support during difficult times. One evening, as Sarah was working late to install new encryption software on the communication systems, Marcus appeared at the entrance to her workstation. He looked more serious than she had ever seen him, and she immediately sensed that something important was happening. Marcus informed her that his team had received new orders for a critical mission that would take them deep into enemy territory. Intelligence had located what appeared to be a major enemy command center, and the SEALs were being sent to gather detailed information about its operations and defenses. The mission was scheduled to begin the next morning, and Marcus's team would be inserted by helicopter before dawn. They expected to be gone for several days, moving through dangerous terrain while avoiding enemy patrols. It was the kind of operation that Marcus had performed dozens of times, but Sarah could tell that he was more concerned about this one than usual. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. There was something he wanted to tell her, something that seemed to weigh heavily on his mind. He started to speak several times, but stopped himself, as if he couldn't find the right words. Finally, Marcus reached into his tactical vest and pulled out his backup sidearm, a compact pistol that SEALs carried for emergency situations. He looked at the weapon for a moment, then placed it on Sarah's desk. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart race. What Marcus said next would change everything between them, and set in motion a series of events that neither of them could have predicted. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he couldn't say about the dangers ahead and his growing feelings for the young communications specialist who had become so important to him. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions and the recognition that this might be the last time they would see each other. Outside, the base continued its nighttime operations, but inside the communications center, time seemed to stand still as two people faced the possibility that tomorrow might bring changes neither of them was prepared for. As Sarah looked at the weapon on her desk, and then back at Marcus's face, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The friendship they had built over the past weeks had evolved into something deeper, more complex, and potentially more dangerous than either of them had intended. The base's evening routine continued around them, but Sarah and Marcus remained frozen in that moment of revelation, both understanding that the mission ahead would test not only Marcus's skills as a SEAL, but also the connection they had forged in the midst of war. The rifle he would hand her the next day would become a symbol of trust, responsibility, and a bond that would define both of their futures in ways they were only beginning to understand. The morning of Marcus's mission arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to blanket the entire base. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with worry about the dangerous operation ahead. She arrived at the communications center earlier than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of Marcus and his team before they departed. As the first rays of sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold and orange, Sarah watched through the window as the SEAL team conducted their final equipment checks. Marcus moved with the practiced efficiency of a veteran warrior, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he kept glancing toward the communications building. The helicopter that would transport the team to their insertion point was already warming up on the landing pad, its rotors creating a thunderous noise that vibrated through the walls of every building on the base. Sarah had heard that sound hundreds of times during her deployment, but today it seemed more ominous, more final than ever before. At exactly 0600 hours, Marcus broke away from his team and walked purposefully toward the communications center. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched him approach, knowing that this would likely be their last conversation before he disappeared into hostile territory for an unknown period of time. When Marcus entered the building, he was carrying his primary weapon, an advanced rifle equipped with specialized optics and modifications that marked it as the tool of an elite operator. Sarah had seen SEALs with their weapons countless times, but she had never paid close attention to the details that made each rifle unique to its operator. Marcus set the rifle down on her desk with careful precision, his hands lingering on the weapon for a moment longer than necessary. The rifle represented years of training, countless missions, and the expertise that had kept him alive through a decade of dangerous operations. It was more than equipment. It was an extension of Marcus himself. Looking directly into Sarah's eyes, Marcus began to explain why he was entrusting her with something so important. He told her that SEALs had a tradition of ensuring their weapons were secured with people they trusted completely, especially when facing missions with uncertain outcomes. The rifle would remain with Sarah until his return, serving as both a practical security measure and a symbolic bond between them. As Marcus spoke, Sarah realized that this gesture represented far more than simple weapon security. In the military culture they both inhabited, a warrior's primary weapon was sacred, never to be handled carelessly or entrusted to anyone without absolute confidence. By giving her his rifle, Marcus was making a statement about the depth of his trust and the significance of their relationship. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders as Marcus explained the weapons care requirements and the security protocols she would need to follow. Every detail mattered, from the proper storage position to the environmental controls that would keep the rifle in perfect condition for his return. But beyond the technical instructions, Sarah could hear the emotion in Marcus's voice. He was telling her things about the rifle that he had never shared with anyone else, personal modifications he had made, and the history of successful missions the weapon had seen. Each detail was a piece of himself that he was leaving in her care. As their conversation continued, other members of Marcus's team began to gather near the communications building, signaling that departure time was approaching. Sarah could see the urgency building, but Marcus seemed reluctant to leave, as if staying a few more minutes might somehow change the nature of the mission ahead. The moment that would define everything between them came when Marcus reached for Sarah's hand and placed it on the rifle's stock. His touch was firm but gentle, and Sarah felt the full significance of what was happening. This was no longer just about weapons security or military protocol. It was about two people acknowledging something profound that had developed between them. Marcus's eyes held hers as he made a promise that would haunt Sarah throughout the days to come. He told her that he would return for the rifle, and when he did, there were things he wanted to discuss with her, things about the future and possibilities that extended far beyond their current deployment. The sound of the helicopter's engines reaching full power interrupted their moment, and Marcus knew he could delay no longer. His team was depending on him, and the mission would not wait for personal concerns. But as he prepared to leave, he made one final gesture that would stay with Sarah long after he was gone. Marcus removed a small item from his tactical vest, something he had carried on every mission for the past 7 years. It was a compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had given it to Marcus when he first enlisted. The compass had guided Marcus through some of the most dangerous terrain in the world, and now he was leaving it with Sarah as a promise of his return. As Marcus finally turned to leave, Sarah felt a mixture of emotions that she struggled to control. Pride at being trusted with something so important to him, fear for his safety during the dangerous mission ahead, and a growing awareness that her feelings for Marcus had evolved into something she hadn't expected when she first arrived at the base. The next several hours passed in a blur of routine activities that felt anything but normal. Sarah went through the motions of her daily responsibilities, checking equipment and maintaining communication links, but her attention kept returning to Marcus's rifle, which now occupied a place of honor in the secure storage area of her workstation. News from the mission came in fragments throughout the first day. The team had been successfully inserted at their target location and had begun their reconnaissance activities. Communications were limited to essential updates only, a standard procedure designed to minimize the risk of enemy interception. By the second day, Sarah had developed a routine centered around caring for Marcus's rifle. She would check on it multiple times throughout her shift, ensuring that the storage environment remained optimal. The weapon had become a tangible connection to Marcus, a physical reminder of his promise to return. The base seemed different without the SEAL team's presence. Other personnel went about their duties as usual, but Sarah noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere, as if everyone was aware that some of their most capable protectors were now beyond the wire, facing unknown dangers in enemy territory. On the third day of the mission, Sarah received news that made her blood run cold. The SEAL team had encountered unexpected enemy resistance during their reconnaissance operation. While all team members were reported safe, they had been forced to take defensive positions and were now essentially trapped in hostile territory until extraction could be arranged. The communication blackout that followed was the most difficult period Sarah had experienced since arriving in Afghanistan. Hours stretched into an eternity of worry and uncertainty, with no word about Marcus's condition or the team's status. Sarah found herself spending even more time near the rifle, as if proximity to the weapon might somehow protect its owner. When communication was finally re-established, Sarah learned that the SEAL team had successfully completed their mission, but at significant personal cost. Marcus had been injured during a firefight with enemy forces, though the extent of his injuries was not immediately clear. Medical evacuation was being arranged, but weather conditions were making helicopter operations extremely dangerous. The news that Marcus was wounded hit Sarah harder than she had expected. The professional distance she had tried to maintain throughout their friendship suddenly seemed impossible to sustain. She realized that her feelings for Marcus had grown far beyond simple friendship or professional respect. As Sarah waited for updates on Marcus's condition and evacuation status, she found herself making promises to a rifle that represented everything she hoped to preserve about the man who owned it. The weapon had become a shrine to possibilities that might never be realized, a symbol of futures that hung in the balance somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan. The base's medical personnel were preparing for the arrival of wounded soldiers, and Sarah could see the controlled urgency in their movements. Everyone understood that the next few hours would be critical, not just for the SEAL team, but for everyone who had come to depend on their expertise and protection. As night fell on the fourth day of the mission, Sarah remained at her post, maintaining the communication links that would guide the medical evacuation helicopter to the pickup point. Marcus's rifle seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights of the communications center, a beacon of hope in an increasingly uncertain situation. The radio crackled to life with updates from the evacuation team, each transmission bringing Sarah closer to learning Marcus's fate. But she also knew that regardless of the outcome, the moment when Marcus had entrusted her with his rifle had changed something fundamental between them, creating a bond that would endure whatever challenges lay ahead. The medical evacuation helicopter appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set on the fifth day of Marcus's mission. Sarah watched from the communications center as the aircraft approached the base, its red cross marking clearly visible against the darkening sky. Her hands trembled as she maintained radio contact with the pilot, guiding the helicopter to a safe landing despite the deteriorating weather conditions. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah's heart raced with anticipation and fear. She had spent the past 2 days in an emotional whirlwind, torn between her professional duties and her personal concern for Marcus. The rifle she had been guarding seemed to pulse with significance as she watched medical personnel rush toward the arriving aircraft. The first stretcher that emerged from the helicopter carried Marcus, and Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her when she saw that he was conscious and alert. His left arm was in a sling, and there were bandages visible on his face, but he was alive and appeared to be in stable condition. As the medical team wheeled him toward the base hospital, Marcus's eyes searched the area around the communications center as if he was looking for someone specific. Sarah wanted desperately to run to him, to see for herself that he was truly safe, but her duties required her to remain at her post until the evacuation was complete. The other wounded members of Marcus's team were also being transported to the hospital, and she needed to coordinate with headquarters about their status and the mission's outcome. The next few hours passed in a blur of reports, communications, and administrative tasks. Sarah learned that the SEAL team had successfully completed their reconnaissance mission, gathering crucial intelligence about enemy positions and planned operations. However, the cost had been significant, with multiple team members wounded and equipment lost during the firefight that had trapped them for 3 days. When Sarah's shift finally ended, she made her way to the base hospital, carrying Marcus's rifle in its protective case. The weapon felt heavier than usual, weighted with the significance of everything that had happened since Marcus had entrusted it to her care. The hospital corridors were quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of medical equipment and the hushed voices of nurses making their rounds. Sarah found Marcus in a private room, sitting up in bed and staring out the window at the mountains where he had spent the past 5 days fighting for survival. When Marcus saw Sarah enter the room with his rifle case, his face lit up with a smile that seemed to erase all the pain and exhaustion from his ordeal. He had been wondering if she was safe, if the base had experienced any enemy activity while his team was away. The sight of her, healthy and carrying his treasured weapon, was more reassuring than any medication the doctors could provide. Sarah approached Marcus's bed carefully, unsure of the extent of his injuries and not wanting to cause him any additional pain. But Marcus reached out with his uninjured arm and pulled her into a gentle embrace that spoke volumes about how much their relationship had meant to him during the darkest moments of his mission. As Sarah placed the rifle case on the table beside Marcus's bed, she began to understand the full significance of what had transpired between them. The weapon had been more than just equipment left in her care. It had been a promise, a symbol of trust, and a bridge between two people who had found something unexpected in the midst of war. Marcus opened the case with practiced movements, his eyes scanning every detail of the rifle to ensure it had been properly maintained during his absence. Sarah watched nervously as he conducted his inspection, hoping that she had followed his instructions correctly and that the weapon met his exacting standards. When Marcus looked up from the rifle, his expression was one of complete satisfaction and gratitude. Sarah had not only cared for his weapon properly but had treated it with the respect and attention that it deserved. In military culture, such dedication to a fellow warrior's equipment was a sign of the highest honor and commitment. But Marcus's examination of the rifle revealed something that Sarah hadn't expected. During his mission, while lying wounded and waiting for evacuation, he had made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The experience of nearly losing everything had clarified his priorities and made him realize what truly mattered to him. As Marcus spoke about his time in the mountains, Sarah learned details about the mission that would never appear in official reports. He told her about the moments when he wasn't sure he would survive, and how thoughts of her and his promise to return had given him the strength to keep fighting. The rifle had represented more than a weapon. It had been a symbol of his commitment to come back to someone who had become incredibly important to him. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. Marcus spoke openly about his feelings for Sarah, admitting that she had become far more than just a friend or colleague. The trust he had shown by giving her his rifle had been his way of expressing emotions that he hadn't known how to put into words. Sarah found herself responding with equal honesty, sharing her own feelings about Marcus and the fear she had experienced during his mission. The professional boundaries they had maintained throughout their friendship seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of what they had discovered about each other. As their conversation deepened, Marcus made a proposal that took Sarah completely by surprise. His injury would require several weeks of recovery, and he had been given the option of returning to the United States for advanced medical treatment. But, more importantly, his commanding officer had approached him about a position training new SEAL recruits, a role that would allow him to remain stateside and be close to his daughter Emma. Marcus asked Sarah to consider requesting a transfer that would allow her to continue her military service at a base near his new assignment. The prospect of building a relationship outside the intense environment of a combat zone was both exciting and terrifying, but Marcus felt that what they had discovered together was worth pursuing. The decision Sarah faced was complicated by numerous factors. Her current deployment was scheduled to continue for several more months, and requesting a transfer would require justification and approval from multiple levels of command. Additionally, relationships between military personnel were subject to regulations and scrutiny that could complicate their careers. But, as Sarah looked at Marcus, still holding his rifle and speaking about possibilities for their future, she realized that some opportunities were too important to lose to bureaucratic concerns. The trust and connection they had built together represented something rare and valuable, especially in the uncertain world of military service. Over the following days, As Marcus recovered from his injuries, Sarah began the process of requesting a transfer. The paperwork was complex, and the approval process would take time, but she was determined to pursue the chance for a life with Marcus away from the dangers of combat zones. The base commander, who had observed the positive effect Sarah's friendship had on Marcus's morale, was supportive of her request. Military leaders understood the importance of maintaining the emotional well-being of their personnel, and stable relationships often contributed to better performance and retention. As Marcus prepared for his medical evacuation to the United States, he and Sarah made plans for maintaining their relationship despite the distance and uncertainty ahead. The rifle that had brought them together would travel with Marcus, but the bond it represented would continue to connect them across whatever challenges they might face. The morning of Marcus's departure was emotional for both of them, but it was tempered by hope and anticipation for the future. As Sarah watched his medical transport aircraft disappear into the distance, she carried with her the memory of the moment when a SEAL had handed her his rifle and changed the course of both their lives forever. 6 months later, Sarah received approval for her transfer and joined Marcus at a training facility in California. The rifle that had symbolized their trust and commitment during the darkest days of war now occupied a place of honor in their shared home, a reminder of how love can flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Marcus's transition to training new SEALs proved to be fulfilling, allowing him to pass on his knowledge and experience while maintaining a stable life with Sarah and regular contact with his daughter Emma. Sarah's technical expertise found new applications in developing communication systems for special operations training, making her an invaluable part of the team. The story of how their relationship began, with a SEAL entrusting his rifle to a communications specialist in a forward operating base, became legendary among their colleagues. It represented the best traditions of military service, trust, commitment, and the recognition that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to open one's heart to another person. Years later, as Marcus and Sarah built a life together that included marriage, a blended family with Emma, and continued service to their country, they would often reflect on the moment that changed everything. The rifle still held a place of honor in their home, but its significance had evolved from a symbol of separation and danger to one of unity and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Their story serves as a reminder that in the midst of war and uncertainty, human connections can provide the strength and hope necessary to survive and thrive. The moment when Marcus handed Sarah his rifle was indeed the moment that changed their story forever, transforming two individual lives into a shared journey of love, commitment, and service that would endure long after their military careers had ended.